The Avignon Papacy, spanning from 1309 to 1377, emerged during a pivotal period in medieval history known as the Late Middle Ages. This era was characterized by profound social, political, and religious transformations that would reshape the European continent. As the 14th century dawned, Europe was experiencing significant changes. The feudal system was gradually declining, cities were growing in importance, and national monarchies were becoming increasingly powerful. The city of Avignon, where this remarkable chapter of papal history unfolded, sits majestically along the banks of the Rhone River in southern France. Despite being situated within French territory, Avignon technically belonged to the Kingdom of Naples during this period. The city's strategic location at the intersection of major trade routes made it an ideal setting for the papal court. The impressive Palais des Papes, which still stands today, was constructed during this period and remains the largest Gothic building in Europe, serving as a testament to the power and wealth of the medieval papacy. The political landscape of 14th-century Europe was dominated by several major powers, each vying for influence and control. The Kingdom of France, under the Capetian and later the Valois dynasties, had emerged as one of the most powerful and centralized monarchies in Europe. Its influence extended well beyond its borders, particularly in ecclesiastical matters. The French crown's growing power would prove instrumental in the papacy's move to Avignon. The Holy Roman Empire, though technically the supreme secular authority in Western Christendom, was experiencing a period of decline and fragmentation. Unlike the increasingly centralized French kingdom, the empire remained a loose confederation of semi-autonomous states, principalities, and free cities, primarily encompassing modern-day Germany and parts of Italy. The emperor's authority was frequently challenged by powerful nobles and independent city-states, particularly in Italy. England was also emerging as a significant power during this period, though it would soon be embroiled in the Hundred Years' War with France. The Italian peninsula, while culturally and economically vibrant, was politically fragmented among various city-states, kingdoms, and papal territories. Rome itself, the traditional seat of papal power, had fallen into a state of disrepair and political chaos, which partly explained why the popes found Avignon more appealing. This complex political landscape was further complicated by the rising power of national monarchies and their increasing assertion of authority over ecclesiastical matters within their territories. The traditional universal authority of the Catholic Church was being challenged by secular rulers who sought to establish greater control over religious institutions within their realms. This tension between secular and religious authority would become one of the defining features of the Avignon Papacy, as the popes struggled to maintain their independence while being physically located within French territory and under French influence. The period also coincided with significant economic and demographic changes. Europe was reaching the peak of its medieval population growth, though this would soon be dramatically altered by the arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century. Trade was flourishing, particularly along the Mediterranean coast and through the great trade fairs of Champagne, making Avignon's location particularly advantageous for the administration of the Church's extensive financial networks. At the heart of the Avignon Papacy's story stands Pope Clement V, born Raymond Bertrand de Got, whose fateful decision in 1309 would alter the course of Catholic Church history. Originally the Archbishop of Bordeaux, Clement V's election as Pope in 1305 was heavily influenced by King Philip IV of France. Upon his elevation to the papacy, Clement V initially resisted settling permanently in Avignon, spending several years traveling through France before finally establishing the papal court there in 1309. His decision was driven by political pressure from the French crown and the increasingly unstable situation in Rome, where rival noble families were engaged in violent power struggles. King Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair, emerges as one of the most influential figures of this period. A shrewd and ambitious monarch, Philip had already demonstrated his willingness to challenge papal authority through his dramatic conflict with Pope Boniface VIII, which had culminated in the infamous outrage of Anagni in 1303. Philip's powerful personality and political maneuvering would cast a long shadow over the papacy throughout the Avignon period. His influence over Clement V was so profound that he successfully pressured the Pope to suppress the wealthy Knights Templar order, leading to their dissolution in 1312. Following Clement V's death in 1314, Jacques d'Huys was elected as Pope John XXII, serving until 1334. John XXII proved to be one of the most significant Avignon popes, modernizing the papal administration and financial system. Despite his advanced age at election, around 72, he ruled for 18 years and established many of the administrative procedures that would characterize the Avignon Papacy. His pontificate saw the development of the papal palace into a sophisticated administrative center, and he was known for his interest in alchemy and his conflicts with the Franciscan order over the question of apostolic poverty. Benedict XII, formerly Jacques Fournier, succeeded John XXII in 1334. A former Cistercian monk and inquisitor, Benedict was known for his austere lifestyle and genuine attempts at reform. He initiated the construction of the imposing Palais des Papes, transforming Avignon's skyline forever. Unlike his predecessors, Benedict actively tried to reduce French influence over the papacy, though with limited success. His reign was marked by attempts to reform monastic orders and eliminate corruption within the church. Clement VI, born Pierre Roger, ascended to the papal throne in 1342 and represented perhaps the height of papal luxury in Avignon. A former Benedictine monk with close ties to the French royal family, he was known for his lavish lifestyle and generous patronage of arts and learning. During his pontificate, the papal court reached new levels of sophistication and ceremonial splendor. When the Black Death struck Europe in 1348, Clement VI showed remarkable leadership, providing care for the sick and protection for Jews who were being blamed for the plague. The subsequent Avignon popes included Innocent VI, 1352–1362, Urban V, 1362–1370, and Gregory XI, 1370–1378. Urban V actually attempted to return the papacy to Rome in 1367, but the unstable conditions there forced him back to Avignon 3 years later. It would finally be Gregory XI who, influenced by the persuasive appeals of Catherine of Siena, permanently returned the papal seat to Rome in 1377, effectively ending the Avignon papacy. Each of these papal figures had to navigate complex relationships with European monarchs, particularly the French kings who succeeded Philip IV, Louis X, Philip V, Charles IV, and Philip VI of the new Valois dynasty. The French crown's influence remained strong throughout the period, though it varied in intensity under different popes and kings. This intimate relationship between the papacy and French monarchy led contemporary critics to view the Avignon popes as mere puppets of the French crown, earning this period the pejorative nickname Babylonian captivity of the Church, drawing a parallel to the ancient Israelites' exile in Babylon. These key figures shaped not only the immediate events of their time but also the long-term development of the Catholic Church, leaving a legacy that would influence religious and political relations throughout Europe for centuries to come. The Avignon Papacy period represents one of the most dramatic manifestations of the age-old struggle between spiritual and temporal power in medieval Europe. At its core, this era exemplified the growing tension between papal authority and the rising power of European monarchs, particularly as nations began to assert their independence from traditional ecclesiastical control. This fundamental conflict would reshape the relationship between church and state for centuries to come. The primary struggle centered on the question of supreme authority in Christian Europe. For centuries, the papacy had claimed both spiritual and temporal supremacy over Christian rulers, based on the doctrine of two swords, spiritual and temporal power, both ultimately derived from God and entrusted to the Church. However, by the 14th century, emerging nation-states, particularly France and England, began to challenge this traditional view, asserting their own sovereign authority independent of papal oversight. The movement of the papacy to Avignon dramatically highlighted this power struggle. While the popes maintained their spiritual authority, their physical presence in French territory and their perceived dependence on French protection significantly undermined their claim to universal temporal authority. This situation was particularly evident in the papacy's inability to effectively intervene in conflicts between Christian monarchs, such as during the 100 Years' War between England and France. A crucial aspect of this power struggle manifested in the realm of taxation and financial control. European monarchs, facing increasing military and administrative costs, began to tax church properties and clergy within their territories, a practice traditionally forbidden without papal approval. Philip IV of France was particularly aggressive in this regard, setting a precedent that other monarchs would follow. The papacy's attempts to resist such taxation often proved futile, revealing their diminishing practical authority over secular rulers. The Avignon period also saw a significant deterioration in the moral authority of the Holy See. The papal court in Avignon developed a reputation for luxury, worldliness, and excessive bureaucracy. The papal administration expanded dramatically, creating a vast and complex system of offices, fees, and taxes that many viewed as corrupt. The practice of selling church offices, simony, and the accumulation of multiple church benefices by single individuals, pluralism, became widespread, despite periodic attempts at reform. This moral decline was exacerbated by the papal court's reputation for luxury and extravagance. The magnificent papal palace in Avignon, while impressive, became a symbol of worldly excess rather than spiritual authority. The contrast between the opulent lifestyle of the papal court and the ideals of Christian simplicity did not go unnoticed by contemporary critics, including prominent figures like Petrarch, who famously referred to Avignon as the Babylon of the West. Another significant source of tension was the increasing nationalism of European kingdoms. As monarchs developed more sophisticated administrative systems and stronger national identities, they sought greater control over church appointments and resources within their territories. This led to conflicts over the right to appoint bishops and abbots, control church revenues, and regulate religious institutions, powers traditionally reserved for the papacy. The papacy's response to these challenges often seemed inconsistent and ineffective. While some Avignon popes attempted to maintain independence from French influence and institute reforms, others appear to acquiesce to royal demands, further undermining papal authority. The practice of appointing predominantly French cardinals during this period also contributed to perceptions of the papacy as a French institution rather than a universal one. The period also saw the emergence of early reformist movements that challenged church authority on theological grounds. John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia began questioning not only the moral conduct of the church hierarchy but also some of its fundamental doctrinal claims. These movements, though suppressed, foreshadowed the more dramatic challenges that would emerge during the Protestant Reformation. The cumulative effect of these conflicts and tensions was a permanent alteration in the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority in Europe. The Avignon Papacy marked a crucial turning point in the decline of papal temporal power, even as the Church maintained its spiritual authority over Western Christendom. The period demonstrated that the medieval ideal of a universal Church exercising both spiritual and temporal authority over all of Christian Europe was no longer sustainable in the face of rising national monarchies and changing political realities. This complex web of conflicts and tensions during the Avignon period would have lasting consequences, contributing to the eventual breakdown of Christian unity in Western Europe and setting the stage for the dramatic religious and political transformations of the following centuries. Life in Avignon during the papal period presented a stark study in contrasts, with a magnificent papal court standing in sharp relief against the backdrop of medieval urban poverty. The Palais des Papes, a fortress palace of unprecedented scale, dominated the cityscape as a symbol of papal power and wealth. Within its walls, daily life proceeded with an opulence that rivaled or exceeded that of any royal court in Europe. The papal palace buzzed with activity, housing not only the pope and his immediate attendants but also hundreds of clerical officials, servants, and visitors. The papal household maintained an extraordinary standard of living, with records showing extensive purchases of exotic spices, fine wines, and luxury goods from across Europe and the Mediterranean. The papal kitchen regularly prepared elaborate feasts, particularly during the reign of Clement VI, who was famous for his lavish entertaining. The Pope's personal apartments featured frescoed walls, tapestries, and the finest furnishings available in medieval Europe. In striking contrast, the common people of Avignon and its surrounding regions lived lives of considerable hardship. While the city's economy benefited from the papal presence, much of the wealth remained concentrated in the hands of church officials, bankers, and merchants who served the papal court. Ordinary citizens faced the usual challenges of medieval urban life: overcrowding, poor sanitation, food insecurity, and vulnerability to disease. The arrival of the Black Death in 1348 dramatically highlighted these disparities, as the poor suffered disproportionately while the wealthy fled to country estates or secured better medical care. The social hierarchy within the church itself reflected and reinforced broader social inequalities. At the top, cardinal bishops lived like princes, maintaining their own courts and households within Avignon. Many came from noble families and accumulated vast personal wealth through multiple church appointments. Below them, a complex bureaucracy of lesser officials, many from wealthy or middle-class backgrounds, handled the daily administration of church affairs. This system created numerous opportunities for well-connected families to place their sons in lucrative church positions. The lower clergy, particularly parish priests and monks in poorer areas, often lived in conditions barely better than their parishioners. This striking disparity between the high and low clergy created tensions within the church and provided ammunition for critics who called for reform. The practice of pluralism, where wealthy clerics held multiple church offices simultaneously, meant that many parish churches were served by poorly paid vicars while the official appointee enjoyed the income elsewhere. Intellectual life in Avignon reflected these social divisions while also transcending them. The papal court attracted scholars, theologians, and artists from across Europe, making Avignon a center of medieval learning and debate. The papal library grew to become one of the largest in Europe, containing thousands of volumes on theology, law, and other subjects. Important theological debates of the era, such as the controversy over apostolic poverty sparked by the spiritual Franciscans, played out within the papal court's halls. These theological disputes often reflected deeper social tensions. The debate over apostolic poverty, for instance, highlighted the contradiction between the Church's enormous wealth and Christ's teaching about poverty. The spiritual Franciscans argued for a literal interpretation of Christ's poverty, implicitly criticizing the Church's accumulation of wealth and power. The papal court's response to such challenges typically favored interpretations that justified existing social and economic arrangements. Daily life in Avignon also reflected the cosmopolitan nature of the papal court. The city attracted visitors from across Christendom, diplomats seeking papal favors, clergy requiring official documents, pilgrims, merchants, and artists. This international atmosphere created a unique cultural environment where different languages, customs, and ideas mingled. The French influence was strong but not exclusive, and Italian, German, English, and Spanish visitors all contributed to the city's character. The development of papal administration during this period led to the growth of a new class of educated professionals: notaries, lawyers, and bureaucrats who managed the increasingly complex business of the Church. These officials formed a distinct social group, neither noble nor common, whose expertise became essential to both church and state administration. The contrast between spiritual ideals and worldly realities was particularly evident in the realm of justice and governance. While the Church maintained courts to address both religious and civil matters, access to justice often depended on social status and wealth. The papal court's reputation for corruption stemmed partly from the perception that favorable decisions could be purchased by those with sufficient means. These social and economic disparities, combined with the theological debates they sparked, contributed to growing criticism of the church hierarchy. Writers like Petrarch condemned the worldliness of the Avignon court, while popular preachers increasingly questioned whether the institutional church truly represented Christian ideals. These tensions would continue to build, contributing to the broader crisis of late medieval Christianity and eventually playing a role in the Reformation movement of the following century. The transfer of the papal seat from Rome to Avignon in 1309 marked one of the most dramatic shifts in church history. The move began almost accidentally, as Pope Clement V, a French archbishop who had been elected in 1305, initially postponed his journey to Rome due to political unrest in the city. This temporary delay became permanent when Clement V, under significant pressure from King Philip IV of France, established his court in Avignon. This decision sent shockwaves through the Christian world, as Rome had been the center of Western Christianity since the time of St. Peter. The event that precipitated this momentous change was rooted in the violent conflict between Pope Boniface VIII and Philip IV of France. The French king's arrest and humiliation of Boniface VIII in 1303, known as the Outrage of Anagni, had demonstrated the growing power of secular monarchs to challenge papal authority. Following Boniface's death, the election of Clement V represented a victory for French interests, beginning what critics would later call the Babylonian captivity of the Church. This period earned its nickname from the parallel with the biblical account of the Jews' exile in Babylon. The comparison was particularly pointed, as it suggested that the papacy, like the ancient Israelites, had been forced into exile by a powerful monarch. The French crown's influence over the Avignon popes became increasingly apparent as all 7 popes of this period were French, and the majority of newly appointed cardinals were also French, effectively ensuring continued French control over papal elections. The most catastrophic event during the Avignon papacy was undoubtedly the arrival of the Black Death in 1348. This devastating pandemic reached Avignon in spring of that year, killing an estimated third of the city's population. Pope Clement VI showed remarkable leadership during this crisis, providing care for the sick and protecting the Jewish community from persecution. However, the Church's inability to stop the plague led many to question its spiritual authority. The papal physicians' failure to provide effective treatments, despite their status as Europe's finest medical practitioners, further undermined the Church's prestige. The plague's impact extended far beyond its immediate death toll. The pandemic disrupted the elaborate administrative and financial networks that the Avignon papacy had built. Church revenues declined sharply as entire communities were wiped out, and the survival of younger clergy members meant that the lucrative fees the Church collected from successions to benefices decreased. Moreover, the plague induced a spiritual crisis as people questioned why God would permit such devastating suffering, and why the prayers and ceremonies of the Church seemed powerless to prevent it. Throughout these tumultuous years, various attempts were made to return the papacy to Rome. Urban V actually succeeded in returning to Rome in 1367, but the city's conditions proved so chaotic that he returned to Avignon 3 years later. It would take the determined efforts of Catherine of Siena and the election of Gregory XI to finally restore the papacy to Rome in 1377, ending this remarkable chapter in church history. If you've enjoyed learning about this fascinating period in medieval history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more historical content. If you were living in medieval Europe during the Avignon Papacy, would you have supported the papacy's return to Rome, or do you think having the papal court in Avignon made more practical sense? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to explain your reasoning. We'll feature the most interesting responses in our next video. Remember, history isn't just about memorizing dates and events. It's about understanding how past decisions and conflicts continue to shape our world today. Your perspective matters in this ongoing conversation about one of history's most intriguing periods. The Avignon Papacy period marked a remarkable flourishing of intellectual and artistic achievement, despite the political tensions of the era. The papal court became a center of learning that attracted scholars, artists, and musicians from across Europe, creating a unique cultural environment that would influence centuries of religious and secular thought. The University of Paris stood as the intellectual cornerstone of theological study during this period, maintaining close ties with the Avignon Papacy. Known as the Queen of Universities, it served as the premier institution for theological debate and the development of canon law. The papal court regularly consulted with Paris theologians on matters of doctrine, and many of the Avignon popes themselves had strong connections to the university. This relationship fostered the systematic compilation and refinement of church law, leading to significant developments in canonical jurisprudence. Canon law underwent substantial development during this period, as the papal administration dealt with increasingly complex legal and administrative challenges. The Avignon Papacy produced numerous legal commentaries and decretals, establishing precedents that would guide church administration for centuries. The papal court's legal experts worked to harmonize various traditions of church law, creating a more coherent and sophisticated legal system that addressed everything from marriage laws to property rights. In the realm of music, the Avignon period witnessed a revolutionary development in polyphonic composition. The Ars Nova movement, championed by composers like Philippe de Vitry and Guillaume de Machaut, introduced innovations in musical notation and rhythm that transformed both sacred and secular music. The papal chapel became a center for musical experimentation, where composers developed increasingly complex harmonies and rhythmic structures. The famous Avignon repertory of this period includes some of the most sophisticated musical compositions of the medieval era. Visual arts flourished within the papal palace walls, where Italian and French artistic traditions merged to create distinctive styles. The palace itself became a canvas for remarkable frescoes, many executed by Italian masters who brought their expertise north. The French Gothic architectural style of the palace was complemented by interior decorations that reflected both northern and southern European aesthetic sensibilities. The papal court's patronage extended to manuscript illumination, with the production of exquisitely decorated religious texts and secular works. However, this period of cultural achievement was accompanied by growing criticism of church corruption and the emergence of heretical movements. John Wycliffe in England began questioning church doctrine and authority, advocating for biblical translation into vernacular languages and criticizing church wealth. His ideas spread to Bohemia through Jan Hus, creating a movement that would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation. The spiritual Franciscans represented another significant challenge to church authority, advocating for absolute poverty and questioning the church's accumulation of wealth. Their persecution by the Avignon Papacy highlighted the tension between spiritual ideals and institutional power. These conflicts generated substantial theological literature as church authorities worked to defend orthodox positions against various challenges. Intellectual life in Avignon was also marked by the early stirrings of Renaissance humanism. Petrarch, who spent considerable time in Avignon, exemplified this new intellectual movement with his emphasis on classical learning and literary excellence. While critical of the papal court's worldliness, his presence there helped establish Avignon as a center of humanist scholarship. The papal library at Avignon became one of Europe's greatest collections of manuscripts, containing works on theology, law, medicine, and classical literature. This library served as a crucial resource for scholars and helped preserve many ancient texts. The papal court scribes and translators worked to expand this collection, copying manuscripts and translating works from Greek and Arabic. The period saw significant developments in educational methods and scholarly practices. The scholastic tradition, while still dominant, began to incorporate new approaches to learning and textual analysis. The development of university curricula and examination methods during this time would influence educational practices for centuries to come. Medical knowledge also advanced under papal patronage, with Avignon's physicians combining traditional Galenic medicine with practical observation. The challenge of the Black Death led to increased attention to public health measures and medical theory, though with limited practical success against the plague itself. Astronomical and mathematical studies progressed as well, often in connection with the Church's need to calculate religious feast days and maintain the calendar. The papal court employed astronomers and mathematicians who contributed to the development of these sciences, though always within the framework of religious orthodoxy. The intellectual climate of Avignon also fostered important developments in mystical theology, with figures like Meister Eckhart and Johannes Tauler developing sophisticated spiritual philosophies that sometimes challenged orthodox boundaries. These mystical traditions would have lasting influence on both Catholic and Protestant spirituality. This rich cultural and intellectual ferment would have lasting consequences for European civilization. The achievements of the Avignon period in law, music, art, and scholarship would influence subsequent generations, while the critical movements that emerged would contribute to the transformations of European Christianity in the following centuries. The period demonstrates how institutional crisis could coexist with remarkable cultural achievement, producing enduring contributions to Western civilization. The Avignon Papacy existed within a complex web of international relations, where religious authority increasingly intersected with emerging national interests. This period marked a crucial transition in the relationship between spiritual and temporal power in medieval Europe, with lasting consequences for the future of Western Christianity. The relationship between the Avignon popes and the French monarchy was particularly complex and often contradictory. While the papacy maintained theoretical independence, its physical location within French territory created an unavoidable dependency. The French kings, particularly Philip IV and his successors, exercised significant influence over papal policy, though this influence varied in intensity throughout the period. French royal pressure manifested in various ways. The selection of predominantly French cardinals, the alignment of papal diplomatic policy with French interests, financial arrangements favorable to the French crown, the papacy's reluctance to condemn French aggression in various conflicts. However, the relationship wasn't entirely one-sided. The popes often attempted to assert their independence and sometimes successfully resisted French demands. They maintained diplomatic relations with other European powers and occasionally took positions contrary to French interests, particularly in matters of church doctrine and administration. The outbreak of the Hundred Years' War in 1337 placed the Avignon Papacy in a precarious position. As tensions between England and France escalated, the papacy's efforts to mediate were increasingly viewed with suspicion due to its perceived alignment with France. This situation had a number of critical consequences. Papal peace initiatives were frequently met with distrust by English authorities, and papal legates struggled to maintain a neutral stance in their negotiations. English hostility toward the papacy grew, and this anti-papal sentiment, in turn, fueled early proto-Protestant movements. Church revenues from England were disrupted as funds were often withheld or seized, weakening the papacy's financial influence. The war not only disrupted traditional revenue streams but also drained resources as military expenses rose, diverting funds that might otherwise support church activities. This economic instability extended across Europe, impacting church operations and making diplomatic missions costly to sustain. The inability of the papacy to prevent warfare among Christian kingdoms began to undermine its moral and religious authority. National churches started aligning more closely with their respective monarchs, politicizing religious appointments and weakening the unity once championed by the papacy. Moreover, organizing crusades against external threats became increasingly complex as the war consumed Europe's attention and resources. Perhaps the most dramatic consequence of this period was the Great Western Schism, which spanned from 1378 to 1417 and resulted in competing papal claims. Several key factors fueled this crisis. The prolonged absence from Rome had weakened the traditional seat of papal authority, and a dominance of French cardinals caused tensions with cardinals of other nationalities. Administrative reforms created competing power centers, while the papal election process lacked clear rules for dispute resolution, leading to divided allegiances. European powers took sides, supporting different papal claimants, and the schism both reflected and deepened national rivalries. Political interests complicated attempts to resolve the crisis, accelerating the formation of national churches and creating fractures within Christendom. The division severely eroded the papacy's authority across Europe. Theological debates on church governance emerged, reform movements gained momentum, and the concept of papal supremacy was irrevocably altered. During the Avignon period, the papacy transformed its approach to international relations. This era saw the establishment of permanent diplomatic missions, the creation of intelligence networks, regular diplomatic correspondence, and a professionalization of papal diplomacy. The papacy expanded into international banking, developed sophisticated financial instruments, standardized taxes and fees, and integrated its finances with European markets. Avignon became a hub of international scholarship, with artistic, literary, and musical influences flowing between regions, and a blending of French and Italian architectural styles. The influences from this period deeply affected European society. State formation processes accelerated, a separation of religious and political authority emerged, diplomatic protocols evolved, and concepts of international law began to take shape. The period fostered increased mobility of educated elites, the growth of international trade networks, the development of urban centers, and an evolution in university systems. National religious identities became more pronounced, with local devotional practices and reform movements gaining traction, shifting the traditional church-state relationship. The Avignon Papacy's international interactions left an enduring impact. Papal administration, diplomatic practices, financial systems, and church-state relations evolved permanently. European traditions merged, new artistic styles emerged, educational systems developed, and religious practices shifted. This period contributed to the conditions leading to the Protestant Reformation, the evolution of modern state systems, the development of international law, and lasting changes in the concepts of religious authority. The legacy of the Avignon Papacy continues to reverberate through religious and political history, leaving an indelible mark on the development of the Catholic Church in European society. This period fundamentally altered the relationship between spiritual and temporal power, creating lasting repercussions that would shape the future of Western Christianity. One of the most significant consequences of the Avignon Papacy was the severe weakening of papal moral and temporal authority. The period demonstrated that the papacy could function away from Rome, inadvertently undermining the symbolic significance of the Eternal City in Catholic tradition. The perceived subordination of the papal office to French interests damaged its claim to universal authority, while the luxurious lifestyle of the Avignon court contradicted Christian ideals of simplicity and spiritual focus. The elaborate administrative system developed in Avignon, while efficient, contributed to growing criticism of church bureaucracy. The expansion of papal taxation and the selling of church offices created an image of an institution more concerned with financial gain than spiritual welfare. This perception of corruption and worldliness provided ammunition for critics who would later call for radical church reform. The Avignon period played a crucial role in preparing the ground for the Protestant Reformation. The criticism of papal wealth and power that emerged during this time established patterns of anticlerical rhetoric that reformers would later develop more fully. The period demonstrated that the Church's traditional claims to universal authority could be successfully challenged, opening the door for more radical questioning of church doctrine and practice. The concentration of French cardinals and popes during this period led to a crisis of legitimacy that would ultimately result in the Western Schism, 1378 to 1417. This subsequent division, with competing popes in Rome and Avignon, further damaged the Church's authority and unity. The schism raised fundamental questions about papal legitimacy and church governance that would influence religious thought for centuries. The Avignon experience also left an important legacy in terms of institutional development. The sophisticated administrative systems created during this period transformed the papacy into a more efficient bureaucratic organization. However, this efficiency came at the cost of spirituality, as the Church began to be seen more as a political and administrative institution than a spiritual one. The period offers enduring lessons about the dangers of allowing religious institutions to become too closely aligned with political power. The French monarchy's influence over the Avignon Papacy demonstrated how political entanglements could compromise religious authority and independence. This lesson would influence later debates about the separation of church and state. The Avignon era also highlights the persistent tension between institutional needs and spiritual ideals. The papacy's attempt to maintain its power through administrative efficiency and political alliances ultimately undermined its spiritual authority. This paradox continues to challenge religious institutions today as they navigate between practical necessities and spiritual mission. Perhaps most significantly, the Avignon Papacy marked the end of the medieval ideal of a unified Christendom under papal leadership. The period demonstrated that national interests and local political power had become too strong to be contained within the traditional framework of universal church authority. This shift would prove crucial in the development of modern Europe, as national churches and secular authorities increasingly asserted their independence from Rome. Looking back, the Avignon Papacy serves as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of wealth and power on religious institutions. The period shows how the pursuit of institutional security and political influence can lead religious organizations away from their spiritual foundations. These lessons remain relevant for understanding the challenges facing religious institutions in their relationships with political power and material wealth. Today, the magnificent papal palace in Avignon stands as a testament to this remarkable period, attracting visitors from around the world. Its grandeur and scale remind us of both the heights of medieval papal power and the dangers of excessive worldliness in religious institutions. The legacy of the Avignon Papacy continues to inform discussions about religious authority, institutional reform, and the proper relationship between spiritual and temporal power. This complex period in church history reminds us that institutions, even those with the highest spiritual aspirations, must constantly guard against the temptations of power and wealth. The Avignon experience stands as a permanent reminder that religious authority rests ultimately on spiritual authenticity rather than political power or administrative efficiency. If you found this exploration of the Avignon Papacy's legacy fascinating, don't forget to share this video with your friends and subscribe to Medieval Chronicles for more captivating journeys through medieval history.